Just a few days ago, Earl Brosnahan Jr., age 89, died of a heart attack. He had been in failing health for some time, but his family issued a statement that, in fact, he was heartbroken over the recent death of his daughter. And then his heart literally gave out the day before her memorial service was scheduled. His daughter was Kate Spade, the fashion designer and celebrity, whose death by suicide, along with that of author and restaurateur Anthony Bourdain that very same week, put yet another public face on the grief far too many families experience, though much more privately than the Brosnahans, the Spades, and the Bourdains. Mr. Brosnahan's death sheds light on another under-discussed reality, how grief affects us as human beings, how grief gets into our bodies, disrupting our sleeping, our eating, our emotions, our health. The Old English word for grief was heart soreness, literally soreness of the heart. And any of you who have experienced the loss of a loved one in particular can likely see the connection. Grief tears at the heart, sometimes literally. It seems broken heart syndrome is a real thing. In a research study from 2012, 2,000 people were assessed during the first 24 hours after a significant grief event occurred in their lives, and their risk for heart attack was found to be 21 times that of a similar population untouched by grief. Now, it's by no means routine for someone to die from grief, but it can happen. More commonly, grief causes physical pain, hinders our immune system, and changes thought patterns and perceptions of reality. When that grief is unaddressed and unresolved, it complicates things. People who don't find healthy ways of coping with their grief sometimes act out with unexpected outbursts of irritability or anger, develop irrational fears about other potential losses, or turn to self-harming behaviors or addictions of all kinds to numb the heart's pain. Sometimes a person just becomes numb emotionally and spiritually, unable to be moved from the depth of their sorrow. Grief affects us as individuals, as human beings. Healthy processing of grief never fully relieves the emptiness we feel after a loss, but it can, over time, allow for new beginnings and new life to emerge. Is it any surprise that remedies for grieving hearts include reaching out, talking with peers and professionals, participating in rituals of closure and remembrance, establishing new routines, becoming physically active? To get healthy, we have to resist the urge to turn inward and instead stretch ourselves and risk ourselves toward a new future. Unresolved grief closes us in and shuts the door on anything other than our sadness, making us oblivious to the truth that the hurt will seep out of us one way or another, whether we realize it or not. So I like to think of David, from our reading from 2 Samuel today, as a textbook good griever. If you know some of David's story, you know he's typically not shy about his emotions. He wears his heart on his sleeve and maybe a couple other places. Maybe that's just part of his personality, but he's got this grieving thing figured out. When David hears that King Saul and the king's son, Jonathan, have both died in the war, David is so visibly upset he tears his clothes. Now, I don't recommend that as a common practice. He mourns, he weeps, not alone, but with the others who are in his household. It's like a big grief party. They all weep and they fast. And David writes a poem, a song, that he insists be learned by everyone in the land. How the mighty have fallen. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Beautiful stuff, David's poetry. He's a good griever, that's for sure. He feels it. He's open about it. He lets others grieve too. He even gives them words to help them express what they're feeling. David is a textbook good griever, but it's this last bit that sets David's grieving apart. Because this isn't really just about David, although there's no doubt this affects him personally. The deaths of Saul and Jonathan set the stage for David to assume the throne of Israel. David's grief cannot be private. And how he grieves is no longer simply a personality trait. It sets the tone for the kind of ruler David might become. Even more than that, it defines the very kingdom he wants to rule. Because let's face it, grief isn't always just a personal thing. There's also such a thing as public grief, community grief, the grief that we feel collectively as a people for losses and tragedies we experience in some way together, and how our leaders respond to that grief with the words they choose to say or tweet or wear on their sleeves or on the backs of their jackets matter. I remember growing up hearing stories of where people were when they heard that President Kennedy had been shot or when Dr. King had been assassinated. Who knew I would have my own stories to tell, as do many of you, of where I was on September 11th, 2001, when terrorists took thousands of lives, or on December 14th, 2012, when a gunman killed 20 school children and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary School, or on August 9th, 2014, when the death of Michael Brown brought so much grief and loss to light. Public grief, community grief, is real. And it's why it matters so much for us to hear a word from those in leadership about those events. President George W. Bush was reading a book with school children at a school in Sarasota, Florida, when Secret Servicemen whispered into his ear the news of those terror attacks on 9/11. He sat in that classroom for another 7 minutes, taking in that news, listening while the children finished the book they were reading, and then praising them for their accomplishments. You know, a lot of people criticized him for staying there with the children. But years later, those children, now adults, remember it differently. One of them said, "I think he was trying to keep everyone calm, starting with us." Another said, "I think he was trying to protect us." It's possible, I think, that that was the most compassionate option, to let those children finish out one more story with a happy ending before their lives and their world changed forever. To let the grief just be for a minute or 7 more. Our need to process public moments of grief is why it mattered when we saw President Obama wipe tears from his eyes as he memorialized those who died in the Sandy Hook massacre, and why it's important to us when public officials show up after natural disasters and human tragedies of all sorts. Just as individual grief requires healing and processing so new beginnings can emerge, public grief, community-wide tragedy, is no different. As one public health physician from Boston, who happens to be one of my former college roommates, posted on social media earlier this week, If reading about the separation of immigrant children is heartbreaking, remember that sobbing is therapeutic. Keep sobbing, she said. It's the key to our humanity. You see, Dr. Liz is a big believer in the idea that we would all be more physically healthy as individuals if we would work harder to heal the social ills that plague our community, our country, and our world. And if we're going to heal those ills, we have to feel them first. Be moved by injustice, be appalled by gun violence, weep in response to the cries of children housed in tender care centers miles away from their parents who risked everything for the hope of a better life. Because unresolved grief isn't good for us as individuals, and it isn't good for us as a community or a country either. You know, it occurred to me that Dr. Liz was the first voice I heard this week that didn't try to distract me with solutions for the immigration problem or defense of a policy, but instead just left room for a little bit of humanity to be realized among the tears. Dr. Liz, the messiest roommate I ever had, gosh, let things just be messy for a little bit, which is what David does as he leads his whole household and then a whole nation, and then the roots of our very faith tradition in pausing for a moment to acknowledge the sorrow that is very real indeed. The losses grieved by David are messy too. You see, Saul had tried on at least 2 occasions to kill David. Jonathan should have been the heir to the throne, but he ceded his place in the line of succession to David behind Saul's back. Saul and Jonathan were at odds, and Israel just suffered a horrific loss at the hands of the Philistines. David's lament, the song he instructs the nation to sing all together now, is, for lack of a better term, fake news. Some might even label it a phony story of grief and sadness. Saul and Jonathan, undivided in life, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. A lesser leader might have rejoiced to be finally rid of Saul, might have blamed their collective losses on Saul, but David surprises God's people and the Philistines, who are fully expecting a military response to their slaughter, by the way. And he surprises you and me, who sometimes don't know what or how to feel anymore, with a chance to linger for a moment in the collective sense of loss. He lifts up only the best of who Saul was. He's open about the complexity of his love for Jonathan. He weeps, he fasts, he sings. He grieves because he knows God grieves too. Our tears are the key to our humanity. Our tears in response to another's tears are signs of our compassion. Walter Brueggemann calls David's lament an act of political courage. It's surely a strange way to build a kingdom, but David's reign is not just about David. It's about the God who called him to lead in the first place. And this is our God, who hears the cries of the Hebrews when they are slaves in Egypt, who sets history in motion in response to the tears of the outcast, and insists on a community that cares for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in our midst. The same God who gave us Jesus, whose earthly father was from the house of David. And Jesus weeps, and his heart is grieved, and his compassion for humanity is political too. It's a strange way to build a kingdom, but that's how God does it. You see, it is possible to be moved, to be heartbroken by something or someone, not because of your political party, not because of a policy whose origin seems obscure, not because you're being manipulated by the media, It's possible to be moved by something or to be heartbroken because you are human and because it's who God made you to be. Because by faith, your spiritual roots are in the house of David, which was built on tears. Because if Jesus saw the way we treat children, families, and each other, I don't know about you, but I have to believe Jesus would be weeping too. Broken heart syndrome is a real thing for grieving individuals, and a real thing for a world full of heartbreak. Grief gets into our bodies, it affects our health, and we have to face it, because if we don't, the pain is going to work its way out one way or another. Our grief as a people cannot be private, especially our grief over what we've lost. What if the greatest loss we experience is the loss of our humanity and the loss of our compassion for our neighbor? Our grief cannot be private if justice is ever to be done, if God's kingdom is ever meant to come. So may God be with us as we learn to grieve together for the sake of justice, for the sake of new life, for the sake of hope, for the sake of each other. Amen.